French Indochina had been ruled by the Japanese from early in World War II. Remember, it was that brought about the American oil embargo, which led the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. During the war, American OSS agents, the precursor to the CIA, worked with a number of rebel leaders fighting the Japanese, including a communist named Ho Chi Minh and his organization, the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh, with OSS help, learned to fight the Japanese in a guerrilla war. The Vietnamese were naturally xenophobic anyway, and with their dislike of foreigners and their knowledge of the land and their real attention to learning what the OSS had to teach them, they became incredible guerrilla fighters. And they drove out, they were in the process of driving out the Japanese from most of the areas. After the war, they expected that we would let them be independent. But the French, remember, whose pride had been harmed by being a German colony during World War II under the Vichy government, insisted that for le droit de république, the French need to return to Indochina. And they insist, and we're going to appease the French because they're allies and they have hurt feelings. So the French come back in, and the Viet Minh then start attacking the French. By 1952-53, the French are on their last legs. The French aggressively move into communist territory at a place called Dien Bien Phu, a valley air base surrounded by hills. The Viet Minh do something that nobody expects. They move heavy artillery to the top of all those hills that surround Dien Bien Phu and start firing down into the valley. The Vietnamese are pulverizing the best of the French army in Indochina. The French send an emissary to the United States begging for nuclear weapons to be deployed, for American atomic bombs to be dropped on the hills around Dien Bien Phu to destroy the Vietnamese positions. We refuse that request because to us it seems like it's from Crazy Town, not France. The French surrender at Dien Bien Phu and withdraw. And with that withdrawal, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam are established. But Vietnam is going to be divided between the Viet Minh-controlled northern area of Vietnam above the 17th parallel of north latitude, whose capital city is Hanoi, and the southern Vietnamese area under President Ngo Dinh Diem, who is a Vietnamese Christian Catholic and who had been friendly with the French. So that's the peace settlement. But elections are agreed to for 1954 between the North and the South to decide what kind of government there should be. The problem is Diem was extremely unpopular. Vietnam is largely a Buddhist country. And the Viet Minh had led the fight against the Japanese and the French. Diem collaborated, and for these reasons, he's a Christian in a Buddhist country, and he's somebody who had some collaboration with the French, at least. It looks like Diem's going to lose the election. So, in a rare move, the United States connives in canceling the elections in the South. And this sets things up for a war that begins in earnest around 1960 with the infiltration from North Vietnam into South Vietnam of North Vietnamese Army troops and the activation of communist cells of guerrilla fighters throughout the South called the Viet Cong. This is going to be a guerrilla war, a war in the jungles of hit-and-run attacks, assassinations, not stand-and-fight battles. The Diem government begins losing the war. The United States, under President Kennedy, sends the Green Berets and other military advisors to help the Diem government survive and to teach them counterinsurgency methods that the British developed in Indonesia. However, Diem systematically intensifies his rule in a way that offends the Buddhists. Soon on American television, Buddhist monks are lighting themselves on fire after having doused themselves with gasoline in a form of suicide protest against the Diem government. The Diem government seems to be on its last legs. So the American ambassador recommends that the CIA overthrow Diem and replace him with a South Vietnamese general, which we do. But everyone knows we did it. So is South Vietnam an independent country, or is it, in fact, an American colony? Is it representative of the people of South Vietnam who are Buddhist, or the new leader is a Buddhist, or is it something representing a foreign interest? Remember, Vietnamese xenophobia is real. It's a big part of their culture. So the fight intensifies. In August of 1964, President Lyndon Johnson authorizes American intervention after what is called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin is here. American carrier forces or American naval forces were off the coasts of South Vietnam and in the Gulf of Tonkin, spying electronically and supporting South Vietnam. The U.S. destroyer Maddox is attacked, apparently by Vietnamese gunboats, North Vietnamese gunboats, on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin on a moonless night where the radar was faulty. It is a question about whether or not that attack ever took place. It may have, it may not, but at the time the Navy said it did, and we believed it. The next night, 2 destroyers, including the Maddox, also seemed to come under attack from North Vietnamese gunboats. The U.S. Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the president to employ lethal force and military power to preserve the freedom of South Vietnam. So in August of 1965, American Army forces begin arriving, including the 7th Air Cavalry. A first battle is fought between the 7th Air Cavalry and Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces, the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley up here near the Chupong Massif. In that battle, American helicopter troops are pitted against light infantry from North Vietnam's army. And in the first phase of the battle at landing zone X-ray, American air power and artillery power is enough to protect a relatively small group of soldiers on the ground, and with firepower, we basically flatten the jungle around it, killing lots of North Vietnamese troops until they withdraw. It's considered a success, and it becomes the blueprint of future battles. The battles are not going to be about terrain. What we decide to do in our brilliance is fight a land war in Asia of attrition, where we're going to kill more of the enemy than they're going to kill of us. This is in Asia, the most populous continent on the planet. Getting involved in a land war in Asia is difficult enough because of the size of the populations and armed forces against you. But getting involved in a land war with Asia, that isn't about territory or strategic positions. It's just about killing the enemy when you find them, which is not a strategy at all, is bizarre. But it appeals to the arrogance of the sort of efficiency experts that President Johnson and Kennedy have put in charge of the Pentagon. The U.S. military is going to view Vietnam like the Spanish Civil War, a testing ground for new weapons, new psychological warfare techniques. We don't take our enemy seriously. We don't respect our enemy. Consequently, we begin to fight and fight and fight. We don't lose a battle, but we ultimately are going to lose the war. By 1968, the Vietnam War is beginning to strain America's willingness to sustain casualties. And then at Chinese New Year, at Lunar New Year, the Tet holiday, There is a massive communist offensive, which includes Vietnamese infiltrators breaking into and holding part of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The old capital city of Hue is taken over for weeks by North Vietnamese army forces. Suddenly, when we have been told that the war is almost over, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, we are in the biggest fight, the biggest communist offensive of the war. And at that point, Walter Cronkite and many in the American media turn against the war. They say it's a war we can't win, we've got to leave. In Vietnam, which up until the current war on terror was our longest war, we lose as many troops as in Korea. But the type of troop is different. The American military is a draftee army in the 1960s and early 1970s. And instead of allowing people to volunteer to go to Vietnam, we want to put a massive army there. The average age of the combat soldier of the American forces in Vietnam was 19 years old. That means half of our troops were 19 or younger. Half of them were 19 or older. These were not volunteers, these were draftees. They expected to go to Europe and take up posts in Germany in case the Russians came across the Fulda Gap. They end up going to the jungles of Vietnam and dying not at the hands of Russians, but at the hands of punji sticks, which are sharpened bamboo covered by solid human waste that you're designed to basically fall through and step on, and it causes sepsis and death. Really nasty too. Vietnam becomes a breaking point for the American culture. The American left and the American Democratic Party turns against the war, even though it was a war begun by two Democrat presidents, Kennedy and Johnson. American university campuses rise up in a counterculture set of war protests, and the agreement that American society had had since the Truman Doctrine, that we will involve ourselves in overseas affairs as the world's policeman to prevent a communist takeover, that is all now called into question. And the American left has not been behind an American war since. Finally, President Nixon in 1972 has reduced American forces in Vietnam and replaced them with more competent South Vietnamese forces. And there are a set of peace talks happening in Paris. These peace talks are, like the peace talks at Panmunjom in Korea, an opportunity for the North Vietnamese to kill enough Americans so that we'll go away. And Nixon seems to be desperately looking for a way to get out of there without losing complete face. Around Christmas 1972, after winning re-election with 49 out of the 50 states, President Nixon orders the Linebacker II offensive, which is a full-scale bombing campaign against Hanoi and North Vietnam for the first time in this war. It's 1972. For the first time, the full power of the American Air Force, short of atomic weapons, is loosed on North Vietnam. Before that, politicians in Washington had decided which targets to hit and which targets not. It's not the way to fight a war. After about a month of Linebacker II attacks, the North Vietnamese come to the peace table, and a peace treaty is agreed. 1973, the Americans pull out of Vietnam with the understanding that if the North Vietnamese invade, America is going to come back. 2 years later, in the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese invade South Vietnam. But by this point, Nixon has resigned because of the Watergate scandal, which was part of the 1972 presidential election. And the Congress is deep in the hands of anti-war Democrats, and there's no way on God's green earth that the Americans are ever going back to Vietnam, at least not at that point. So North Vietnam is allowed to conquer South Vietnam, and for the first time in history, if you kill enough Americans, we'll go away, works. And what's left is the communist country of North Vietnam, where within a year of taking power, over 1 million South Vietnamese who had worked closely with us are murdered. And over the next 10 or 15 years, massive emigration from South Vietnam, desperately onto rafts towards Hong Kong, creates a phenomenon called the boat people. So Vietnam is a big turning point in the Cold War where America's attitude and willingness to fight changes.